Welcome. My name is Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future Program at the New America Foundation, a think tank here in DC, of course. And this is Broadband Revolution, for developing a national broadband strategy to keep the U.S. prosperous in the 21st century. And we're going to start the program this afternoon by hearing first from two commissioners of the FCC, and then we'll bring up our panel after that to present and talk about the E-North Carolina report and the issue more broadly, and we'll have a chance at the end for you all to ask questions or make some comments on what you hear today. So this is, for New America, the first in a series of events on national broadband strategy. Our view is that broadband is really the essential public infrastructure for the 21st century. It's an input into the production of every other good and service in society. And in that sense, we should really see it as we have other essential technological inputs in the past. So for example, a century ago, the challenge became to make electricity and telephony available and affordable to every American. And that was something we had to work hard at with public investment and public policy initiative. And a half century ago, the challenge became an interstate highway system and an air traffic system, which, by the way, both of those seem to need quite a bit of revamping today. But today's greater challenge in a more global world is broadband, and it is going to require public investment and public policy initiative. It's no longer a luxury. Back in 2001, when President Bush appointed Michael Powell as chairman of the FCC, one of the very first things that he came out with in reaction to the issue of the digital divide was he was calling it the so-called digital divide. He said we may as well say that there's a Mercedes-Benz divide because I'm envious and I want one, but I can't afford it. And since 2001, under his stewardship and beyond, the United States has fallen from 4th in the world in broadband to 15th and continuing to fall. And so really there is a tremendous challenge, and that challenge, as you heard today, I think too, is not only limited, it's not only about connectivity, availability, speed, and price. New America's perspective, which we had too, is that it's also about, if we look a little further down the road, it's also about pervasive connectivity. Because wireless broadband, in the short term, is the quickest and most affordable way to get some fast connections into the hands of everybody in rural areas where it's not affordable to string wire, and in other places. It's also a complement. Even if we could have fiber to every home and every business, we would still want to have the seamless, anytime connections of wireless. And that's why we've been making a real emphasis on opening up the airwaves for unlicensed access for community broadband. So for example, the current proceeding, which if you come to our events, you know all about opening, for example, all of the vacant TV channels in each market for unlicensed access, which would be rocket fuel for community wireless networks. So with that as a backdrop, let me turn it over to the two commissioners. First up will be Commissioner Michael Copps, who is now in his second term at the FCC. He was originally sworn in May of 2001. He had just come at that point recently from being Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade Development. And Commissioner Copps has a North Carolina connection, as most of our, majority of our speakers do today. He has a PhD in U.S. history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And one thing, luckily I can kind of say it by way of an umbrella introduction for both of these men, is that they both dedicated their careers to fighting for the public interest at the FCC. I don't think we've ever seen, certainly not in my memory, a time when the two minority commissioners, minority party commissioners at the FCC have had such tremendous influence on the agenda and in what's gotten done, and have done so in such a way that has just unabashedly put them on the side of the public interest. So with that,
Notice there's a Carolina connection here, Carolina Wood. Thanks, Michael, for the nice introduction and for everything that you and the foundation do to help me and help Jonathan, and help the commission and help Congress and help the country to better understand the implications of the Broadband Revolution. And a special thanks to Jim Baller and Casey Lyde for putting together such an excellent white paper on broadband. It's up and out today. I'm not entirely through the 150 pages and nearly 400 footnotes of the draft that I saw. But, you know, the best compliment I can pay that paper is to say my biggest regret is that the FCC wasn't the one to do it, because we're supposed to be doing those kinds of things and not forcing other folks to have to spend their precious resources to do it. Now, I know we came today to talk about the great state of North Carolina, where I did go to school, but indulge me for just a second to mention its sister state of South Carolina, another one of the places that I call home. Just last week, my old boss, Senator Fritz Hollings, whom I've worked for 15 years, returned for the first time since his retirement from the Senate to Washington, to this building, on the occasion of publishing his new book, Making Government Work. I'm not here to pitch his book, but I was reminded of the work that he led to bring technology and jobs to South Carolina starting 60 years ago. You know, he and North Carolina's governor at the time, Terry Sanford, had this very friendly but very intense competition as both worked for their states, and that competition did work for both their states. And Fritz used to say that South Carolina's challenge through the years had been finding jobs for people, but that with the coming of manufacturing and high tech, it became finding people for the jobs that he and Terry Sanford were bringing into their states, finding people who were trained and educated to take advantage of the manufacturing and then the high tech environment that was coming to be all pervasive even in South Carolina. So he knew that his challenge was to change the state from one with too many people chasing too few jobs to one where new technology coming in would be able to find people who were capable of really performing those jobs with skill to make themselves and their state competitive. And today that challenge is clearly getting broadband infrastructure out to all of our people so that they have the tools and the education and the training and the job opportunity available to them, no matter who they are, where they live, or what their economic circumstances happen to be. And since I only have a very few minutes today, I will spare you most of my lengthy lament about our nation's lack of a broadband strategy. Many of you have heard me speak on this before. I will just refer you instead to the fine section of Jim's paper that does exactly that for us. Suffice it to say that I favor having a real national broadband strategy, a coordinated public-private partnership to meet the central infrastructure challenge of our time. And we don't have that now, and we are shortchanging the country by not having it, and the time has come to fix this problem that is holding America back in so many, many ways. Next year, change will come to Washington. We will have a new president, and according to many of the pundits and handicappers, probably a more activist Congress. There will be new opportunity to focus on broadband, and I hope we do so aggressively and up front early on. Building the private-public sector partnerships we need to have, coordinating all the different agencies of government, obtaining whatever legislative incentives that are needed, and figuring out how to finance an infrastructure that will cost, and let's face up to it, tens of billions of dollars, is going to require a commitment at the very top, not just a campaign pledge, but a mobilization of resources across this land. And if we're going to do this, we don't have any more time to waste. And if we're not going to do this, then let's just admit it and settle for number 15 or 20, or whatever our global position in broadband currently happens to be. I think we should start with the White House broadband czar, someone to take charge of coordinating the effort and making sure that all of the needed resources are brought together. First job is the federal government getting its act together, making sure that all the agencies and departments are working in tandem. Is the Department of Housing and Urban Development making sure that every new low-income housing project is wired for high-speed broadband when the building goes up? When the Department of Agriculture makes its broadband loans, about making sure it multiplies rather than replicates the efforts of the Universal Service Fund? If 99% of schools and libraries now have the internet, might the Small Business Administration be interested in seeing if we could leverage that to create a wireless network in surrounding areas where there is no broadband currently available? Shouldn't the Department of Education be brought in to promote computer literacy so our kids can learn how to use all of these tools that are going to spell the difference between opportunity and poverty for them? Here's just a mini example of the kind of effort I envision. 8 years ago, we were preparing for the Y2K transition. Remember that being in Congress, and I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce at that time. And Congress, of course, had a lead role. But the White House made sure that every agency was pulling together, that we were working with state and local authorities, that we were reaching out to business, reaching out to the private sector, and that was an international problem, so made sure that we were reaching out to other countries. And we did that every month and every week and every day as we got closer and closer to January 1, 2000. And added inducement, we knew that if we failed, somebody at the very, very top of the file was going to be mightily upset with us, not to mention 300 million Americans. It's that type of coordinated effort that's still lacking in, for example, the DTV transition. And that's one reason we're going to have more problems with that than a lot of people may presently think. And it's that kind of effort that the much greater challenge of broadband demands on an even greater scale. Now, there's a lot that the FCC itself could be doing too, and one of the most important steps the Commission should take right now is to guarantee the openness of the internet. To ensure this, the time has come for the Commission to have on the books a clear and enforceable principle of non-discrimination on the network. AT&T agreed to precisely that kind of principle when it purchased Bell South. AT&T doesn't seem to have suffered very much as a result of going forward with that commitment. But that commitment expires at the end of the year, and it applies to only one company, and that's not enough. And Congress may well step in to create such an approach, but the Commission on its own could establish an expeditious and a case-by-case process for adjudicating claims of unreasonable discrimination based on that general principle. And that way, over time, we would develop kind of a body of case law or a body of precedent or whatever you want to call it that would provide some clear rules of the road for those who operate on the edge of the network, namely consumers and entrepreneurs, as well as for those companies that operate the networks. Another thing we should do is refocus universal service on the mission of broadband. Take North Carolina, for example. According to the ENC Authority, at the end of 2006, 16% of all North Carolina households had no access to broadband. And the number is considerably worse in 21 of the most rural counties. And I hate to think what the numbers would be if we had measured with something other than the FCC's tired old 200 kilobits per second as a definition of broadband. Universal service generally worked to get plain old telephone service, POTS as they call it, out across America. But in this 21st century, it's not the POTS, it's the PANs, pretty awesome new stuff that we need to be worried about and that we need to focus on and that we need to get out to all of our colleagues. And that's what's going to determine whether our citizens are able to compete and thrive in the broadband revolution. And the North Carolina case quickly makes one other thing clear, and that's that the states are beginning to step in where the FCC and the federal government have abandoned the field. Extraordinary broadband experimentation is being done not only by North Carolina, but a lot of other states I have visited around this country of ours. And at a minimum, you know, the FCC should start by cataloging and learning about these various experiments and understanding this innovation and trying to understand if what's working in some places applicable elsewhere. And certainly as a clearinghouse, and there's so many things we could be doing. And not only understanding what's going on here at home in the US of A, but understanding what other countries are doing. It's not that we have to emulate them or mimic other cultures that may be very different in fundamental ways from ours, but for heaven's sake, there might be lessons to learn, little tips to pick up, little ways to help us finally step up to the plate and meet this challenge. There's so much we don't know, and there's so much that we need to know. So let me close with my good friend Commissioner Adelstein and many other terrific speakers and panelists are here. But if I leave you with one thing today, I hope it's a sense of urgency. Broadband is a revolution, and revolutions have winners, and revolutions have losers, and we need to be winners. It's a big deal, as everybody says in this campaign here. It's a big deal. The stakes are as high as they can be. And let's not allow ourselves to have this debate hijacked and all of a sudden it becomes, oh, is this liberal or conservative, or oh, is this regulation or deregulation? I mean, that kind of foolishness has gotten us off track on so many different policy questions in the United States of America. We've got to grow beyond that and get a little bit serious. This is about our future in jobs and economic opportunity and education and how we communicate and so very much more. And it's a huge challenge. But you know what? It is not unprecedented. It is how we built this country of ours, with business and government at all levels and communities all pulling together to get a big job done. Michael alluded to this, but from bridges and roads and ports and canals in the early days of this country to regional and then transcontinental railroads to highways in the Eisenhower years and through the story of electricity that you mentioned and basic telecom and so much more. Why don't we learn from that past instead of deciding that, well, here comes this new infrastructure challenge, maybe the most liberating one of all, but we don't need to remember that stuff from the past. Let the market do it, everything will happen, everything will be on autopilot, and we'll get down and we'll be number one, and we all see where that's gotten us. So we got a lot of work to do, but I look forward to working with you and with my colleagues in the Commission and in other agencies in Congress and states and localities and really all the stakeholders, traditional and non-traditional, as we hopefully step up to the plate and emerge winners of the broadband revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now we'll hear from Commissioner Cobb's colleague, Jonathan Adelstein, who is also in his second term at the FCC and has been a commissioner since December of 2002. And Commissioner Adelstein was 15 years a staff member here in the United States Senate, where he ended his time here as senior legislative aide to Majority Leader Tom Daschle, and then was confirmed for the FCC. And he's really stood out as well as an advocate of improving universal service and as an advocate for a substantive national broadband strategy. So, without further ado, Commissioner Adelstein.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to America Foundation for doing this. It's good to be back in my old office building where I remember getting thrashed here. However, Senator Daschle, as the verb goes, so I won't keep that as foremost my memory, because I had a lot of good memories besides that one of being in this building and trying to do great work. And it's so wonderful to have the opportunity to work in the Senate. As you all know, it's good to be back, and it's especially great to be back to highlight the importance of broadband on the release of this new study, which really is a cause for celebration. It's great to be joined by my colleague, Commissioner Copps, who laid out so well the importance of broadband. We agree so fundamentally on this issue. It reminds me of something I heard at a congressional hearing one time, which is everything's been said, but not everybody's said it. So I'll try to avoid being repetitious here because he's so right on. And so is this report, which really reflects what I and my colleague have been trying to communicate. And again, thank Jim Baller for the fine work on this thing, and Mark Calabrese, who've been such passionate and eloquent supporters for the need for national broadband policy. We're going to hear more from them today. And Diana Oberger of EDUCAUSE and Stan Fenley from Fiber to the Home Council that are challenging us, Stan, to try to get really high-speed broadband out to everyone, set ambitious goals and try to get it done. This is got to be a higher national priority than it is today. I think this study underscores that in many different ways. We need greater leadership than we've seen thus far from every level of government, from the federal, state, local, tribal. It needs to be coordinated. And just to underscore what Commissioner Couch said is, why is there a need for a government role in this? Unlike, say, for example, getting Mercedes out to all Americans. We don't want to do that. We think, well, the market will probably allocate Mercedes appropriately. But there is a need to make sure that everybody benefits from this technology revolution, from the array of new services that are going to be available and transforming the way that we live. And of course, the other reason is our global competitors are doing it on a governmental basis, and they are, as a result, leapfrogging us. One way to look at this is to look at all the big issues in the 08 campaign and how broadband really reflects those. The economy. We talk about the economy. Broadband is essential to our productivity, global competition, to prevent outsourcing. Instead of outsourcing to other countries that have put in great broadband infrastructures, we should be insourcing into rural America to make sure that all our citizens have economic opportunities, no matter what part of the country they live in, so they can stay where they grew up if they choose to live there. Healthcare, we talk about healthcare costs. There's all kinds of ways, I won't go into detail, that broadband can reduce healthcare costs, improve educational opportunities for everybody, improve public safety, having a nationwide interoperable broadband network. Even when it comes to energy and the environment, top shelf issues today, but we know we can reduce energy consumption and we can improve the environment through telecommuting and the use of all kinds of data services. People with disabilities, we're concerned about involving them in the economy, particularly in the wake of the war in the Persian Gulf. Why not give them new opportunities through broadband to participate in the economy? And the democracy itself, the way we're seeing this democracy re-enlivened by broadband participation and the way communities are sprouting up, it's like we've never seen before. It could bring back vitality to our own democracy. The way economists look at this is externalities. There are things that broadband brings, benefits, that don't accrue to the company itself that invests in it. In other words, the profits that are derived from these broadband networks don't take into account all the benefits to society as a whole. As a result, there won't be an optimal level of investment if we look at the marketplace alone. That's why our global competitors have implemented broadband strategies. We've made some progress here in this country, but we're behind. I won't go into all the statistics, you know them all. But we face challenges on adoption and on availability, competition, and affordability. And the one key factor I'd like to emphasize, because we all fight about penetration rates, no point getting into those debates. I mean, there should be a question. America should be number one by any standard. And why are we sitting here debating, well, it's really not number 15. You take into account households and move up to number 12. Isn't that great? Well, I think we have to be a little bit more ambitious in our goals. I think America should be number one. That's how we have led the world in our economic power in the 20th century, and we're going to lose that edge in the 21st century if we don't do better. According to the most recent data, we're seeing that the U.S. is 11th in the price per megabit. That's the one statistic I like to look at. You go to other countries like Japan, and they get 4 times as much speed for, I guess we pay 4 times as much for broadband that is 1/10 as fast as Japan. We can't continue leadership that way. So what we need to do is have a national broadband strategy. That's what this report cues up. And a lot of the elements of a broadband strategy are well known. And I don't need to go through them all here. So Commissioner Copps went through some, but we are having more and more reports stacked up on my desk as to how to come up with a national broadband strategy. What we need now is the leadership to actually implement those. In the way that I think we've talked about, you need to rely on the private sector. The private sector in this country is going to drive deployment. Some other countries have different models, different views. In order to make the private sector have the incentives to do that, I think it requires greater focus from our policy leaders. I think we need everybody to work together to make this possible. I was at a NextCom conference last week, meeting with some of the CEOs from the telecom companies, and there's enormous common ground that we have with the largest telecommunications companies in America. They understand the need to get this out. They understand that we need to work together to make it happen, and it's got to be cooperative. I mean, what happens if you don't get broadband, then communities will turn to it themselves and engage in municipal broadband. And they should be allowed to do that if they feel that it's come to that. Preferable would be if we can find ways to make the private sector do what it is that they want to do, which is get this out. And the national government needs to set benchmarks in order to do that. You can't just say, well, we want broadband. You need to set benchmarks. How do you get there? You need to have deployment timetables. You need to have measurable thresholds to gauge your progress. You need to set ambitious goals. We've started to move up from 200 kilobits to 758, I think. It's still not enough. We've improved our data mapping, but we need to work with the private sector, these public-private partnerships to get that done. We need to have incentives for investment. Competition, of course, drives deployment and service like nothing else. Universal service has to move towards broadband. Wireless is really the potential third channel to the home. I don't think we've done everything we can on that front. But when you look at a cross-governmental solution, looking at coordinating across all the different agencies, for example, NTI needs to identify more spectrum that we can get into the private marketplace for use in broadband networks. The government's sitting on a lot of that. And there's a lot that the Congress can do that the FCC, of course, has no role over in terms of tax credits and depreciation rules. These are things that can bring a consensus together with the private sector, with the telecommunications providers. There's a lot in it for them in terms of universal service, tax policy, loans and grants to the rural utility service, making sure we engage in basic science, research and development to a greater extent than we have, which is the basis for all progress. Math and science education, computer literacy, and making sure ultimately that children have computers. I was talking to some of the telecom executives, they recognize this, getting the demand side between aggregation and especially having computers out for everybody. Our global competitors are doing that. In Korea, you go to the local library, your kid can rent a computer for $1 or $2 a month. Why should all the Korean kids have computers and the American kids don't? What's happening in this country when we're being leapfrogged that way? There's no point in having a broadband connection if you don't have a computer in the home. There's nothing good for it. Computers are getting down in their price points. This is something that we can, I think, all work toward. Now, one way to generate support and to work on that consensus with industry and the private sector and governments at all levels is to have national broadband summit that would really bring this together. I think we should do it sooner rather than later. If we can't, we'll have to wait until the next administration. It would be preferable to get that done soon. Today's report suggests that North Carolina plans to hold broadband summits in order to develop local input on the broadband strategy. We need to do that on a national level. I think it's unfortunate that the states are kind of left to their own like this. I think it's wonderful that ENC is doing what it's doing, and we really need that. But in the absence of a federal effort, states have to step up like that. And state efforts like this would be more successful if they were working together with federal leadership. I think we need to involve all levels of government. And this is a rare opportunity here today at this conference to talk about a proactive state like North Carolina, what we can learn on a federal level from what's happening in North Carolina and other states that are taking the bull by the horns here and really moving us forward. It's what I read of it, I didn't finish it, but I did read the whole summary. It is a fantastic report. It really shows that North Carolina has taken this up as a challenge, and speeds are higher than the national average there, but broadband availability is hitting a bit of a plateau, it appears, and you need to have the government working on a leadership basis to get that done. And you really developed a lot of innovative approaches to foster broadband deployment, and you've really been active on a lot of the things we're talking about doing on a national level, mapping where broadband's available. And then you bump into a problem where you can't get the data. Why isn't the federal government making sure you can get the data so the state that's trying its best can get what it needs? Aggregating demand, educating the public about broadband, and providing hands-on training, lowering costs for hardware and software. This kind of development of creative public-private partnerships is just what we need. And ultimately, we'll have to have targeted subsidies to move it along to the areas that are hardest to serve. So I think, Jim, your report is very useful. It really provides a good history and recommendations for state and federal policymakers alike. So I certainly thank you and ENC for the contribution to this dialogue and the willingness of everybody here today, to all the speakers and everybody who's come out, and try to share their expertise. Because we really do need to work together in this kind of fashion in order to get where we want to be on broadband, which is to be the unquestioned leader in the world in technology and in broadband. So thank you for having me, and best of luck with everything you're doing here today.
Both of the commissioners are on an extremely tight schedule, so I just wanted, we're going to have more of a chance for questions and discussion at the end of the program, but I just wanted to, I think they have a couple minutes. If there's, starting with any members of the press here, if there are any particular questions for Commissioner Cox or Commissioner Adelstein, they'll be happy to do that before they leave, and then we'll transition to the panel. Any, and please identify yourself.
Elizabeth Foster from Congressional Quarterly. Do you believe that a universal service fund should be used to promote broadband?
I think absolutely we need to transition to universal service. The question is, should universal service be used for broadband? Right now we're spending almost $5 billion a year to subsidize voice service, and voice is increasingly becoming just one application over broadband pipes. Congress clearly envisioned in the Telecommunications Act that universal service would have an evolving definition. And in Section 254 involving USF, advanced services is mentioned 4 or 5 times. So Congress envisioned this. We need at the FCC to make sure that we are following what Congress intended, making sure that definition evolves. We've got to have that commitment to connectivity that extends from just voice now to broadband, to make sure that the pipes in rural America are every bit as robust as they are anywhere else in the country. The purpose of universal service is comparable service at comparable prices. That should apply not just to voice, but to broadband as well.
And I would just add that we have a recommendation from the Universal Service Joint Board, on which I serve, to incorporate broadband into universal service. So that's out for comment. Again, it needs to be part of a larger strategy. It mentions an amount of money which is probably nowhere near the amount of money that's going to be needed to actually get this infrastructure built. I don't want to scare anybody away, but I ran across an interesting statistic. I haven't really had a chance to verify, but we talked about the interstate highway system. When that was built, it was built at a cost of $27 billion. If you translate that into $2005, which I think the figure I saw is like $196 billion. I don't want to scare anybody off, because building highways and laying fiber are 2 different types of things, but it just is to show that we can't just assume we get this stuff on the cheap, and if we're going to have a commitment, we have to put the resources behind it, and that's what we need to do here.
Yeah, a similar comparison would be what Sweden did. Sweden came up with $800 million in subsidies for rural parts of Sweden, which in the United States would be the equivalent of about $30 billion, a little bit more modest. But you know, if Sweden can do it and they're succeeding, why can't the United States?
Yeah, what's great about fiber is once it's in there, you don't have to resurface it. We have one.
Jeff Daly, Uprising.com. I had a quick question. From the basis of what's best for our country, which do you think is a better place to put our focus? On trying to encourage competition between last mile access technologies, or on trying to establish a common infrastructure on which competition between services can thrive?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know that I can give you a definitive answer on that. I think what I'm talking about is having a partnership to work through questions like this. I think we have paid a price for not having competition in the last mile of infrastructure in this country of ours. We have not had enough competition. that's really from lack of foresight and really lack of putting together, making a commitment of putting together a common sense approach. So I know it's an either or type of situation, but as Jonathan said, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, in the private sector, public sector partnership, I mean, the private sector is going to have to be given, you know, it's going to lead the way. We rely on the private sector, but there has to be coordination. There has to be certainty that there's something in it for the companies to kind of not just compete, but to understand the commitment so that we're working toward a common goal.
A complex question, you could go on at length about it, but we have to look at the American tradition, what's realistic and what's possible here. We've gone down the path here of really having facilities-based competition as the driver, and yet we kind of fallen short on that. We haven't really made sure that wireless is a full participant in that level of competition. Other countries that have a different culture, a different approach, and more government ownership of, for example, telecommunications infrastructure, have relied on that common sharing of networks in a way that isn't as realistic here. You had the great advantage of having a built-out cable infrastructure, but what we did was stop at that duopolistic type of competition. It didn't really ensure that there was a third pipe. If you're going to rely on competitive markets in order to do it, you have to have a third competitor. Any basic antitrust lawyer will explain the importance of that third competitor. So I think we need to look at our spectrum policies in a much more intensive way as a means of generating the kind of competition that would result if we had enough available for a real third channel into the home, and that would make a huge difference.
And again, you know, there's places where we've discovered the market does not go, so then you have to look at innovative approaches and experimentation. And I think the reports of the death of municipal Wi-Fi, municipal broadband are decidedly premature, and it's kind of the conventional wisdom that I pick up a newspaper and they say all those experiments failed, but all those experiments have not failed. There's still a lot of them that are up and running, and a lot of them have had to overcome tremendous obstacles and the very forceful opposition of the big network providers and state legislatures and elsewhere to get off the ground, but they're still working. That's the kind of thing we should be encouraging, not discouraging.
Yeah, very true. One last question right here.
Diana Neff is the video. We are a consultant to municipal organizations, and I just wanted to let the commissioners know today at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, they're voting on a recommendation to the federal government for a national broadband policy. It's being sponsored by the cities of Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, and Miami. They're doing the vote this afternoon. I hope
Is it wires up and pass?
Excuse me?
Is it pass?
Well, the vote is this afternoon, and I'll be happy to give Michael the link to that. We're very much sure that that's going to happen. We're also very interested in what's going to happen with the 700 D block. That had a potential, particularly for rural communities, of being very beneficial, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, as you know, we had a very successful auction, and the 700 megahertz raised almost $20 billion. The outstanding part that was not satisfactorily dispatched was the D block. And I think it is the consensus of the commission, or something close to a consensus, that we need to try to do this public sector, private sector partnership to see if we can build a public safety broadband network so that we have some interoperability, so that the country is really up to dealing with major natural catastrophes or terror attacks or whatever it is. We're doing it a little bit differently this time because we're not driven by a drop-dead date like we had last time for the auction. So hopefully we can get all of our ducks in a row and learn from the mistakes that were made in the last auction and do the mid-course corrections. But the biggest problem we have right now is really finding the expertise to exactly how do you design that network so it meets the special exigencies of the public safety community and at the same time is sufficiently viable commercially to draw a bidder to it. And that's very, very difficult to get to And so far, I think we've had a lot of assertions on different sides of the question, but not the kind of real expertise we need. So I'm trying to prod the public safety community to come up with that. And I'm trying to prod our own FCC to make sure that we have the expertise. And I don't think we're all the way there yet in the advisory. And we have a technical, this is a kind of a surprising thing. We have a technical advisory committee that we're supposed to have at the FCC. It hasn't been in 2 years. And then we're wondering, how do you get the expertise? And we have ready-made out there. You have a form, it's all approved, you don't have to go through paperwork to set it up. We don't have any chairman, we don't have any members, and we therefore lack the expertise.
Well, I just came from Vegas last week, and I venture to bet that mayors will vote for that resolution. And that's because we're hearing from state, local governments, tribal governments, they're pleading for us to take a more active role in helping them to ensure that their citizens have access to broadband networks. They understand on the ground how important this is to economic development in rural areas as well as urban areas. States and local governments are taking upon themselves in many different case studies which are useful for us to look at, but you look at North Carolina today and Kentucky and Fort Wayne, Indiana, all these places that are having leadership that's making the effort, but their citizens might end up a little bit better off than other citizens in the country, but what about those states that haven't been lucky enough to have leadership that's taking upon themselves? And even those programs in North Carolina and others are frustrated, as I read the report, by the lack of help from the federal government in terms of data, in terms of strategies. Every state shouldn't have to invent this in every city by themselves. The governments on all levels should be working together to figure out how we're going to do this in partnership, and it can be much more effective that way for everybody. So I'm pleased to hear that mayors are doing that, and I certainly hope and expect it will pass, and that we will take heed of it, and that we will realize that there's a need for federal leadership, and immediately. We can't afford to wait. Other countries back in 2001, 2000, you read about how far ahead of us they are now. They've been planning this for years in Asia and in Sweden and other countries around the world. We are way behind the 8 ball here, a country that normally is on the cutting edge of technology. A country, after all, that invented the internet is now finding that it's falling behind. So hopefully we'll really step it up, and efforts like this here today will really help kickstart. So thank you for having us.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you both for joining us and taking time out. I know your schedules are pretty pressed, so we'll let you go off now and transition to Jim Baller right next. Thank you. So Jim's going to come up first and talk about his report, for which there's an executive summary, and is there a link on the web here for the report? Okay. Jim would say about that. Jim Baller is founder and president of the Baller Herbst Law Group, a national firm based here in Washington that specializes in representing local governments and public utilities in matters involving telecommunications. He's also a founder of the Community Broadband Coalition, which is a consortium of consumer and high-tech groups that support community broadband initiatives. Last year, NATOA honored him as its first community broadband visionary of the year award. So, and Jim is the primary author of this report with his colleague Casey Lai. So I'll turn it over to Jim, and at the end, he also has a little visual demonstration on broadband speed for you.
Thank you very much. I can't tell you how delighted I am that we have the level of turnout for this session. Michael, thank you so much for putting it together. Speakers, thank you so much for being here. Catherine Rice, Jeff Daly, thank you for help in writing this paper. And most of all, Jane Patterson, Angie, Carrie. ENC Authority is, in my opinion, far and away the most thoughtful and creative state organization working in this field. They were doing 5 years ago what many states now are only beginning to consider doing. They've developed a wealth of information about what works and what doesn't work. And they said to us, Jim and Casey, where do we lean our ladder over the next 5 years? what should we be doing to make sure that we are working not only to improve adoption and availability of broadband in North Carolina, but the right kind of broadband? What level of bandwidth should we be working toward? What technologies should we be working toward? And in our report, which is a massive piece of work, you can now download the whole report at www.e-nc.org and then migrate to the report. Is that right, Carrie? Okay, you can find that whole report there. But even so, it's obsolete already in some respects. We filled it up with dozens of studies, case histories, and other information because we wanted to make broadband real. How's it being used? How can it be used? Where are other countries going? How are they using this? And we looked at economic development. That was our primary goal because North Carolina has lost 100,000 jobs in the last few years in traditional manufacturing areas. So economic development is our main focus, but we also look at educational opportunity at all levels. And here's one of the ways in which the report is obsolete in one respect. Just now, we learned today about a report developed by the State Educational Technology Directors Association that says we have 98% coverage of broadband in our schools, our elementary schools, and it's the wrong broadband. It doesn't have enough capacity. It won't enable our kids to get the level of education that they need. We have in the United States 100 million young people. As Jonas Salk once said, our main responsibility is to be good ancestors. How good a job are we doing at that? In laying before our young generation the infrastructure that will enable them to be the leaders of the world. And what about our elderly populations? What about our handicapped people? Well, we look at all of that. We look at education. We look at public safety, homeland security. We look at environmental sustainability. We can't do what we're doing very much longer. We have got to solve those problems, and broadband is a key to enabling that process to work. Telework. How are we going to cope with 4 to 5 and what's the upper end of gasoline prices? Budget-busting gasoline prices. How do we cope with that? Certainly we all know that broadband has a part in making that possible. It's essential that we do that. And urban revitalization, quality government service, entertainment, cultural enrichment, and the list goes on and on. As Michael put it at the start, broadband is an input for every other good and service in society. And that's so true. And on top of all of that, they're all expanding at the same time. You can't look at one area and say that's all the broadband you need for that area, because they're all expanding at the same time. And as a person from Nortel recently put it, the key in looking at bandwidth capacity is video. As we move to higher and higher definition video, the Humvee, she said, high definition video is the Humvee of broadband, and as we move gradually into more and more usage of video, our internet traffic and our need, particularly at the local level, not necessarily at the core of the internet, but at the local level, is going to expand dramatically. So how much bandwidth capacity is enough? That's a very difficult question. The question itself means a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. Are we talking about a particular application? Are we talking about a local network? Are we talking about a national network? Well, the way we ask that question in our report is to say, how much bandwidth capacity as a nation should we be striving for to ensure that our residents, our businesses, and our institutions have enough to be able to use the applications that will enable us to thrive as a nation in the emerging knowledge-based information economy. And that's what we tried to do in our paper. Now, our own conclusion is that we should be striving toward at least 100 megabits per second of capacity by 2012, at least a gigabit by 2015, and that's all controversial. There are people who are going to say, well, we don't need all that bandwidth capacity, at least everybody doesn't. Some are going to say that's not enough. It takes a long time to build networks, and by the time we build the networks out, we'll be past 100 megabits per second. We'll be up at the gigabit level. Well, we tend to view that we come out closer to those who say we need more. Great nations build key infrastructure with a lot of headroom. They don't whine about advantages that others have, supposed advantages that others have. They do what it takes to be great and to stay great. Are we doing that? We haven't so far, but we can and we should and we will if the voices of all of us work together to do this. How can we do this? What will it take for our country to rise again to the greatness that we all think that we should have and that the evidence that we read doesn't support today? Well, first of all, you heard it from the commissioners, you've heard it from us for years, you've heard it from so many other voices. We can't do this public sector alone, we can't do it private sector alone. We have to work together in the spirit of harmony, mutual respect, urgency, and commitment. We can do that. We ourselves are trying to mix and match people from all industries. We're trying to create violent agreement on our goals, violent agreement on ways to get there, on action plans that are meaningful, that are backed up by good data, that are backed up by a commitment to getting things done that have lines of responsibility and accountability. That's what we need if we're going to do this as a nation. And as Commissioner Kopp said, if this meeting does nothing else but create a common sense of urgency, that we've got to get moving, that we have to push both candidates. Both of them have excellent positions, but we need to push them. I would be the happiest person in this town if Senator Obama and Senator McCain said, on this one issue, we completely agree. We have no dispute over this. Whichever one of us is elected will make broadband policy a very high priority. We will get on with the business early on, and that to help them out, we have consensus among the major shareholders on the main planks of a national broadband policy. We will certainly never be able to agree on everything, but we can certainly eliminate a lot of issues and find that we do have a lot of consensus on those issues. And so one of the fortunate things about speaking third is, as I listened to the presentations of Commissioner Adelstein and Commissioner Cox, I was there striking out paragraphs of my presentation. So I'll just stop right here and give you a visual demonstration that I think will help you appreciate what the difference is and why we think we need a lot more bandwidth capacity than DSL or cable can provide. And if I could get some help in bringing this forward, I'll do it myself. What I'll do is I'll just come down here and get us set up to do this.
Get this out of the skylights.
Remind me to show you the technology working.
Some people may have to swing around to see it.
All right, now this tool was developed in the Netherlands, and what it enables us to do is to compare speeds of the leading technologies as are set forward there. At the bottom, you choose the application, for example, an MP3 song, a DVD music, video, email attachment, and so on and so forth, X-ray photos, and so on and so forth. Click Start, and you'll see timers crawling across the page. Now, let me just add before I do that, here's about where we are as a nation right now on the average. Okay, that's where we are, be it through DSL or even cable modem service. We're sort of migrating this way, kind of slowly. Here is, right up here is where Japan, South Korea are as a general matter. In Japan today, there's nearly 100% availability, and roughly 85% of the households in Japan have access to lightning fast fiber connectivity. The cutting edge of competition in Japan is at about 1 gigabit per second. That's where the companies compete at that sort of level. You can already get gigabit throughout all of Hong Kong. Singapore is moving to that level, half the country by 2012, the rest of the country by 2015. Many nations in Europe are making a commitment now toward building fiber networks which will be able to support 100 megabits per second at a minimum early on, and then higher later. So let's look at this. Let's use an example. Let's say,
Jim, you might mention the difference between the blue and the red.
I'm going to. As a first example, let's look at X-ray photo. Let's say you live 5 hours drive from a hospital center, and you would like to have your local doctor send your X-rays. Forget about CAT scans, which are much more dense, but just X-rays to the center for evaluation, okay? And I've selected an X-ray photo, and for that, having download capacity is not the key, it's upload capacity, because you're going to send it from your provider site to the center. Now, what you'll see on this chart is that there are blues and reds, okay? And I'm going to press start. Boom, it's done. Okay, I'll stop it and I'll start it again and I'll get out of the way. I'm sorry. Okay, well, we're well done in the Asian countries and the leading European countries. And you know, here's download, but that's not what matters to us. What matters is the red, upload, because we want to get those X-rays to the center. Well, that's one example. Okay, how about another one? How about an instructional video? We are living in a world in which manufacturers, business companies everywhere, the United States and elsewhere, break down tasks into modules, and they source those modules to any country in the world where those modules can be done quickly. And if we want our workers to be able to participate in those value chains around the world, they have to be able to participate in those exchanges. And there are often going to be instructions on how to do these things. And how long would it take an instructional video to this time download to a worker in the US as opposed to a worker in one of the leading nations? And I'll click start. Okay. Okay, you get the idea. All right, we can come back at the end of the day and we'll still be crawling along here in the US, but take a look at how fast this is happening in other countries. We will make available through Michael and New America Foundation this tool. You're welcome to use it and play with it. I think that it illustrates more than 100 pages of words why we as a nation need to put our pedal to the metal and get down here get down in this range, why we can't compete with a world that is operating at this range when we were up here at 1 to 4 or maybe up to 9 or 10 megabits per second. And there's no reason why we should assume that we can't get faster speeds everywhere, including to our rural areas, including to our distressed urban areas. And by God, I am confident that if we put our leadership of government, our leadership of our industry and others heads together in a common mission to solve these challenges, we can do it. Now, I'm going to end here. Jane is going to be next. As part of her program, she has a brief video that the folks in North Carolina use. So to minimize this screen going up and down, we're going to turn first to Jane's video, and then Jane will make a presentation. Thank you all.
And as it's getting started, I'd like to just introduce Jane Smith-Patterson, who commissioned this report that's being released today. Jane is the executive director of the ENC Authority in North Carolina, of course, which has a goal of bringing affordable, high-speed internet access to all citizens, and especially in rural areas. I think she'll talk a bit about that dichotomy. Jane's been in that role since 2001 and previously served under Governor Hunt during his 4 terms, I think at the end as Senior Advisor for Science and Technology and Director of the State Office of Technology. He has a long, distinguished private sector background before that.
Okay, I just wanted to point out, yes, just a second.
Activity fosters prosperity.
Go ahead, Jane.
Go ahead. No, I just wanted to point out that when you're out going around the state, you have to explain to people all the time what you're doing. And you want to build leadership at the local level. So we wanted to get something that anyone could use to start a speech, either Rotarians, Kiwanis, or whoever, and also to sort of help drag them with us in this second go-around, or redux, if you would say, to create a much higher broadband push for the state.
Our state's long, vibrant history speaks to this truth. The more we are connected, the more we enrich the lives of every citizen. Each generation has heard this call and proven itself up to the challenge. From the steel spines of railroad tracks to the paved routes leading from farms to market. From the wide open sky claimed by the Wright brothers to the coursing data of telecommunications that made North Carolina such a natural home for the banking, manufacturing, and biotech industries. Each of these advances is a symbol of modernism, a unique blend of bravery and common sense. Just imagine our state if these bold decisions hadn't been made by each generation's leaders. No safe, usable roadways, no burgeoning industries, no towering skyscrapers or thriving metro areas, no connections. Today, we ourselves have a remarkable opportunity, a new chance to show the world North Carolina still possesses that pioneering soul. Broadband internet embodies the next connection. It can help people build a life, bringing us closer to commerce, healthcare, public safety, education, training, and our government. Businesses can reach around the globe. Personal knowledge is unleashed. But some areas of our state still don't have access to this tool that many of us take for granted, putting them at a dramatic and increasing disadvantage. North Carolina and the United States are falling behind. The ENC Authority is asking you to take notice. Join us to help our citizens, especially those in rural areas, access this new tool to build connected communities and make our entire state more competitive in the new knowledge-based global economy. The first wave of change is already underway, but to reach our goal of covering the entire state with affordable broadband internet access, we need our leaders from government and the private sector to rise to the level of our forefathers. We are at a defining moment for our state. Millions of people's lives, farmer and scholar, shopkeeper and soldier, will dramatically improve if we embrace this one commitment. If we demand that this state deserves nothing more and nothing less than real opportunity for us all. The time is now. The decision is in your hands. Show the world that North Carolina is still a leader and a pioneer. Make the connection.
So, ready to help?
Get this screen out of your way.
Good afternoon. We appreciate the New America Foundation hosting this and letting us come along for the ride. It is rather awesome for us to have both the Commissioners, Cox and Adelstein, I guess, join us today. Having EDUCAUSE and Fiber to the Home as part of this is icing on the cake because, see, Diana is really from Raleigh and Corning has strong North Carolina connections. Jim McCleskey, who was here briefly, as one of our earliest cyber warriors, we use our state office to try to get information into places that we need to come to in North Carolina. We have a significant role that we played in history. We've worked really hard in broadband in North Carolina for the last 7 years. I don't think many of you realize that the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, because none of the other states would respond. North Carolina responded to the Wright brothers and said, come on, we'll help you build this. And many citizens pitched in at night and worked in those tents to help the Wright brothers fly. But before that, Marconi was in North Carolina. And Marconi actually transmitted the first wireless music in North Carolina. And every year, the Marconi Society meets in North Carolina. We also did the first listserv between UNC and Duke. We can get together, except in basketball. We had the first gigapop between MCNC and Georgia Tech. We had the first Sunsite in North Carolina. We have mBiblio, which is the library of the internet. And we also have worked really hard on Abilene and Internet 2, working between NC State, Duke, and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, helped to birth also the Lambda Rail project. Now, if any of you don't know what some of these are, you should ask people who are here. We've done digital statewide networks, the first one in the country. We did the ATM Sonnet network in North Carolina. And we worked always with our providers, with the public-private sector working together. We have worked with the carriers. We have worked for telecom, both those with wireline and those that are cable. We've worked with wireless, and we have tried to work some with satellite. We'll get into that too much. With our push ahead on broadband, though, we still have a long way to go in North Carolina. I had thought when I served on the U.S. National Information Infrastructure Advisory Council that we'd be at 100 megabits by now. That was a few years ago, back in 1995, 1996, but we're not there. And I think that what we have seen is that it will take more than just the states. A lot of states are working on this. But we need to make certain that there is a national broadband push at the national level. I'd just like to share with you briefly a few vignettes of what's changing in North Carolina and then leave you with a thought about the national broadband push. With broadband in North Carolina, we've had citizens who've gone out and worked to create fiber networks and community networks in rural mountain counties. A publisher led that, along with a bunch of folks who were just interested. We have to have broadband. From 7 miles of fiber, there are 120 miles of fiber now in Polk and in Rutherford counties. We started it with money from the ENC. The Golden Leaf Foundation picked up with that. The Appalachian Regional Commission gave a few dollars, and an economic development partnership in the western part of the state moved in to help with that. What did that lead to? Think about the fact that farmers in those counties had lost a lot of textile jobs themselves. They survived by a textile job and a farming opportunity. And so textiles were gone, furniture was gone, and tobacco was gone in those two counties. But farmers have now learned to use the internet, and we've hooked them up with the chefs in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the chefs have, you've heard of demand build, we've got demand buy to eat. The chefs tell them what they want to them to grow, they grow it, and the farmers then ship that back to Charlotte. And Staples comes up at night and delivers during the day, and at night dead heads back to Charlotte with their products back into Charlotte. Those farmers learn to use the internet. This is broadband opportunity for them. And as one said to me, you know, I've virtually been to Charlotte before I ever physically went there. I could not imagine someone not having been to Charlotte who lived 65 miles away. But he went there virtually the first time. We have wireless internet in the mountains by the Mountain Area Information Network. And we have the highest mountains east of the Rockies. We love to have you come there, but you now can really get connected to broadband there. I just want to give you a few examples that people just don't realize that how much this means for a state. We're a big state. We are now the 10th largest state, expected to be the 7th largest by 2014. We have lots of miles. It is further from Raleigh, Manio to Murphy than it is from Raleigh to Boston. Think about how big a state that is. And so we are pushing to have, in this last year, actually completed a virtual high school where 19,000 students signed on last year. Those 19,000 students need to be able to sign on from home and not just to sign on from the local library or the local high school. Our authority is very unusual and not too difficult, we hope, from something that other states could do. We are not a nonprofit. We are a government authority. We're housed in a nonprofit. We receive money from the state, not too much. We received a lot from a private nonprofit called MCNC, and we received $30 million, which we jump-started this initiative back in 2001. We now are up to about 82%, 83% of households on the average across North Carolina who can get high speed, not the full broadband that we're hearing talked about. And that's why we're going back out this fall to ask the citizens to join us in another revolution, a second revolution, one we started in 2001 and one we want to restart now. And in North Carolina, in case you don't know, being a woman, I will tell you this, that the first revolution by women in this country was in the town of Edenton, where we dumped the tea in the harbor a good 20 years before they did this in Boston, and told them we will not wear your clothes and we will not drink your tea. And they ran these incredible cartoons of women walking naked in the streets of Edenton, North Carolina, in England. So anyway, North Carolina has a history of saying we won't sign the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And that's why the video you saw was important, to say to the citizens of North Carolina, we need you again. We need to move our leadership in the state to help us move forward. And having said that, I would say to you, we need to move our leadership at the national level. We cannot get that last 16% without the help of a national broadband policy. No state, in my opinion, can do that. And I would simply end by saying to you this. The resolution of Representatives Ashew, Doyle, and Markey, which is the Senate Resolution 191, titled 100 Megabit Nation as a national goal, is very important that we support that. Why is that? As a very small child, I watched John Glenn and the astronauts train in the planetarium at UNC Chapel Hill. They trained to learn to actually, how do I guide myself by the stars as I try to circumnavigate the Earth? And what did it take? A national push by a person who said, we will get a man on the moon. You could have said a woman, right? But a person on the moon within the next decade. And John Kennedy said that, and Lyndon Johnson and this country and the legislature delivered that. What we need is exactly that today. Is a push from the leadership in this country and all 50 governors and the territory leaders of our country to help us move forward in our states and in the territories. Our citizens really deserve nothing less, and our economy will not be the economy you and I have known unless we have that. Thank you very much. We're glad you're here. We need your help in the states. We need the legislatures to help us. We need the governors. We need the heads of our great universities. Diana's husband is the head of NC State University. We have two career family here, as many of us are. We need every single person, whether they are on a farm, whether they are in a dislocated worker from a textile mill, or whether they are the president of a Fortune 100 company, or they're in the top canyons and skyscrapers of Charlotte, in the banks, in the second highest center in this world for banking. We need every single person to help us. So we were glad to move forward to try to help fund this effort by Jim. It really is great because it is a compilation of what's going on around this country, and you can show the leaders, look, this is going on here. This is what's happening in the world. You know, come join this revolution with us. And we hope that you will do the same. Thanks.
Jim and Stan come up as Diana comes up to speed. So we have our whole panel up here. So next up is Diana Oblinger, who is the president and CEO of EDUCAUSE, which represents the nation's universities and colleges on issues of technology, including broadband, of course. Diana is an adjunct professor at North Carolina State University, and also extremely relevant was that previously she was vice president and chief information officer for the 16-campus University of North Carolina system, and like Jane, with a very strong private sector technology background before that. So another North Carolinian, let me introduce Diana.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate EDUCAUSE being invited to comment, and appreciate the support on a major issue for us, which is all about big broadband. And let me just underscore a few things. First of all, we applaud North Carolina for doing this, and EDUCAUSE specifically supports those 8 recommendations that are detailed in the report. So absolutely, totally agree with that at the national level. Second thing that we can underscore is very simply that broadband has become a vital infrastructure. We need it. You've heard that. We don't need to reinforce that perhaps any more than already has been done. But let me also reinforce that the private sector alone cannot do this. Hasn't been able to do it, won't be able to do it. It is really going to take a public-private partnership to make all of this happen for everyone's benefit. And that I think that a national broadband strategy and a commitment of resources to it is going to be absolutely essential. So those points you've already heard, but let me just take a few minutes to talk about why I think it is so absolutely important, not just as someone involved with information technology, but as a citizen of North Carolina. And the first example I would give you deals with Eastern North Carolina. And the moral of the story is that there is a very strong linkage between economic opportunity and education and attainment. I work with a place called the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation on NC State's Centennial Campus. And one of the things that the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation worries about is what are the educational needs out there and what kinds of things are we providing to make that happen. Well, one of the things that has been very obvious working with schools and communities in Eastern North Carolina is that kids look around them and say, there are no jobs. Why bother graduating from high school? Because I've got no place to go. Might as well quit now and start earning a little bit of money. So the lack of economic opportunity, because of the lack of infrastructure and other things, causes them to stop short on their education. Those who do complete their education many times end up leaving the county because of the lack of economic opportunity. So no broadband simply creates a negative kind of spiral, rather than what we all hope for our communities, which would be a positive spiral. So there's an interconnection between economic opportunity and educational attainment. And I probably don't need to tell anybody that education is absolutely important for economic vitality. Second example, from the state of Iowa. You'll see references to the state of Iowa in that report. And the moral of this story is economic vitality and competitiveness. Now, I'm not a native North Carolinian. You can probably tell that by my accent. I grew up in Iowa. And we've made lots of jokes over the years about it being a rural state and cows and plows and all those kinds of things. And the area that I come from is now actually a major economic magnet in the state of Iowa in the corn and soybean fields. The area around Cedar Rapids, seeing Cedar Rapids and Iowa City under floodwaters, that's the latest news that you'd have. But that part of the country invested early and significantly in the internet. So the economic and educational opportunity in that area is not just the University of Iowa. That whole corridor, as it is now called, is a magnet for all kinds of jobs. It has led to growth of the economy. It has led to much greater diversity in that part of the state of Iowa and great job opportunities. People come there and they stay there because of the quality of life and the quality of the jobs and the quality of education. And the internet made a difference. And if you look at the report, we'll find a specific example of looking at Cedar Rapids, Iowa, outcompeting another town, Waterloo, because of broadband in that community. So there's a real link to economic competitiveness. The third story I would give you is a very personal one that deals with Watauga County and the presence of the internet having something to do with where people choose to live. Now, a number of years ago, my husband and I decided that we wanted, when we retired, to live in Watauga County, out in the mountains of North Carolina. Bought a piece of land. And we've been waiting and waiting for the internet to come to that location. It hasn't come. And I honestly don't see any prospect of that happening. And we've begun talking about selling that piece of land and staying in Wake County because we won't have the capacity to continue to work, to continue to educate, to shop, to bank, to stay in touch with our family because the internet, broadband is in Watauga County at Appalachian State, but if you're not right there, you don't have that opportunity. So what does that do? I think it further consolidates a lot of the economic wealth in the state in some of the large counties rather than allowing people the opportunity to live where they want to and do the things they choose. And the fourth example is again one that's relatively personal. It's about an employee of ours, a young woman who comes from Coates, North Carolina. And the moral of this story is that it's important for the future to have broadband because of our kids' education. And that education doesn't just happen in the classroom. Carrie's brother's a high school student, as I said, lives in Coates, North Carolina in a rural area, and he's a very bright high schooler. But they can't get broadband because of where they live. And his learning isn't just about distance education courses or AP courses online. What many of us don't automatically think about is that kids spend about 7% of their time in formal education environments, in classrooms and schools, 7%. What do they do with the rest of that time? If they go home and do not have access to the internet, there's a wealth of opportunities that are simply not available to them, that are to other people. 7% out of all that time the kids have. And people are doing wonderfully productive things with their free time, with their choice of the things that they're interested in. I'll give you a quick example of a project that NASA did a few years ago. They needed help mapping craters on Mars. There's something like 80,000 craters, or some incredible number. They enlisted kids and citizen scientists. They said, you all help us. And they gave them a little bit of instruction, and people voluntarily mapped craters on Mars with the average expertise of someone who was a certified expert. We see all kinds of these projects where kids are volunteering to do things that make social significance, whether it is looking at climate change, whether it's sharing poetry, music, worrying about civil justice, mentoring other people, and all of those opportunities come through the internet. If it's not there, what do those children choose to do with their time that perhaps is not as enriching? So it's not just the school, it's all the rest of the time, and it's not just the kids, it's the entire family. So as a citizen, as well as someone who worries a lot about education, I think there are huge reasons why we need a national broadband policy. So I would just conclude with, I think, the same point you've heard over and over and over again, and that is for the sake of our country, for the sake of our citizens, for everyone's sake, we do need a national broadband policy. That's something surely we can all get behind, as Jane said, make the connection.
I think in sharing those stories, Diana was also too modest to mention, so I will, that EDUCAUSE also released a really excellent major report on national broadband strategy several months ago, which is available on their website. So you should take a look at that. I think the recommendations in the two reports together, really cover this ground very well. So our final panelist today is Stan Fendley, who is the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Policy for Corning. And he's here today on behalf of the Fiber to the Home Council, which he was the driving force in pulling together. Stan has lots of experience up here on Capitol Hill in the Senate, in fact, for both the finance and small business committees, and is a real expert on the whole fiber to the home issue. Stan.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. I will be very brief. Thank you, first of all, for having us and putting this together. And congratulations, Jane, on your foresight and your leadership, and Jim and Casey on putting this report together. It's a very thoughtful, insightful report. I'm going to spend the rest of my afternoon digging into the details of it. It's one thing that's great to see is that there's coalescence now about this moonshot type concept that you were talking about, Jane, of 100 megabit nation. That's something the Fiber to Home Council proposed. I must give some credit to Intel and Cisco and TechNet, who first, I think, proposed this idea of having 100 megabits everywhere in the country back in 2002, when everybody thought that was crazy. Now, EDUCAUSE has endorsed that concept, ENC has endorsed that concept, and importantly, as Jane mentioned, there is a resolution in both the House and the Senate to have a national goal of having 100 megabits everywhere in the country by 2015. And on the Senate side, it's Senator Rockefeller and Senator Obama. On the Senate side, it's Mrs. Eshoo and Chairman Markey and Mr. Doyle and Mr. Sullivan, I believe. But it's great to see. I think that moonshot sort of idea start to catch hold. And you know, look, Corning's a fiber guy. By the way, Corning produces optical fiber. People always wonder, you know, why the Corningware guy cares about broadband. But we care about broadband a lot, both for us and for the country. And clearly, I'm a fiber advocate. But from the aspect of the interest of the United States, whatever technology gets us there, whether it's fiber to the home or VDSL or WiMAX or whatever it is, that's what's important. People say, yeah, what are we going to do with 100 megabits? The answer is a lot. I live in a very, very broadband intensive home. I've got two cabinets, 12-year-old and 9-year-old, who use video applications all the time. My 12-year-old, his best friend moved to China, and he video conferences with a kid 2 or 3 times a week. I walk through my house, and here's the kid's face on a computer screen, and he's talking back and forth. Hey Daniel, how you doing? Oh, hi, Mr. Finley, how are you? And it's all in real time. It's amazing technology. I have a 30 megabit connection from Verizon, right? And the great thing, and my wife, by the way, who teaches at Wake Forest, has figured out how to download YouTube videos and put them in her PowerPoint presentation, right? She says students love that. And so she's constantly downloading stuff. I'm constantly downloading stuff. My 9-year-old is becoming the world's greatest video gamer, and there are actually some good video games out there. So there's a lot to be done, and there's a big demand. I recommend to your readership a new report by Cisco that talks about the fact that we are quickly becoming globally a zettabyte world. A zettabyte is bigger than an exabyte, bigger than a petabyte. It's a lot of bandwidth coming through the pipes. And what it says is actually that our infrastructure is insufficient to handle the demand, which is what we're talking about. So that's great. There's one very important thing I think that we've got to focus on as a matter of national policy. You know, the Asians, I tell you, again, as a fiber guy, the Asians are building out fiber to the home like crazy. And people say, yeah, but it's densely populated there. That cannot be the answer. That cannot be the answer for this country. Right? The United States has faced that time and again since the founding of the country. We've always been a place with lots of rural areas, and we've faced that with telecommunications, transportation, going all the way back to the intercontinental railway system and the telegraph system. We've always found a way to cover that distance, and so we cannot cede the superiority in that technology to other countries. And I would say my company sells a lot of fiber to those guys, and I'm happy to have the fiber coming from an American company rather than a Japanese company. NTT was our biggest customer until a few years ago. But as an American, that cannot be the answer. We cannot cede that technology to them. I want to read a quote to you. There's a research firm called Numerities did a study last year talking about the amount of investment that has to occur in the network in the United States. It says roughly 42 to 55 billion, or 60 to 70% more than the service providers are currently planning to invest. But it talks about the implications of not making the investment. The next Google, YouTube, or Amazon might not arise, but not because of a lack of demand, but due to an inability to fulfill that demand. And I couldn't agree more. I think if I were my company were an application provider, right, I would be incredibly invested in getting as much bandwidth in the United States of America as I could, so I could do it here, and I didn't have to, frankly, travel to Japan to build the next iteration of my application. Jim, one thing I note in your report, on page 85, there's a discussion of companies located in big bandwidth towns around the country. And I say towns because a lot of them are very small places, like Bristol, Tennessee, and Bristol, Virginia, where I know you had a role in bringing bandwidth there. And so I think the point is the economic development aspects that you hear people talk about broadband, that's real. That's real. This is very important from a national perspective. So thank you again for your leadership. I think this is very important, and we look forward to working with you and the others who have spoken for that national policy.
Thank you to all the speakers. I feared we probably were too ambitious in packing things in, but we do have at least a little bit of time, and of course, obviously, if anybody needs to leave, go ahead. But if you have questions for the audience, for our panel here, please identify yourselves, or if you want to bring to our attention anything else we should know about Art.
I'm Art Brodsky from Public Knowledge. Here's my question. Mr. Finley got me thinking, as did Jane. When you have all this increased demand, for your kids doing video across the room and for education, and the response of the largest network operators is to put in bandwidth caps, how do you reconcile those two different versions of the world? One wants to tamp down usage and one wants to keep usage going. Where does the public-private partnership meet? And how do you work out that conflict of worldview?
Can I respond real quickly to that? I was on a panel with guys from last week in Nexcom in Las Vegas, which were guys from Verizon and AT&T, and somebody asked a similar question to the Verizon on a panel. His question was, what would happen to the demand on your network, to the capacity on your network, if you lifted the restrictive devices you have on your panel? And the Verizon guy said, hey, we don't have any restrictive. I know that is occurring with some carriers, okay, but there are distinctions, and a lot of it has to do with bandwidth.
Right, I mean, fiber is a very small place, very few places, relatively speaking, with cable industry.
I understand. But my point is, I think that's where we need to go, right? If we have enough bandwidth. I think that the issues largely go away when you have enough bandwidth. But let me say that those of us in the equipment sector, we were the guys who first proposed the access principles that the FCC adopted. I think it's in all of our interest, whether the carrier realizes it or not. I think it's in their interest, right, not to block, not to degrade, because they need the great cool applications coming over the pipes, just like the applications guys need the pipes. And so I understand your question. It's hard to answer correctly, but I want to make a point that I think there are distinctions in what's happening out there. One good thing is that for the first time in this country, we have competition, and we're starting to have competition in triple play services, because the cable guys are getting telephony, and the telco guys are being forced into the TV market. That's a very, very good thing. It doesn't exist in a lot of other countries, actually.
All right, let me say that tamping down usage would certainly be inconsistent with what we urged ENC in North Carolina to establish as their goals. We think broadband and bandwidth usage is a good thing. With all the things that you can do with it, the more the better. And so we urged North Carolina to be bold and establish 2 goals for itself by 2012, to be in the top 5 states in the nation, which would be significant advance for it in both broadband adoption, which is a calculation of numbers by households or otherwise, plus bandwidth usage. We want them to use bandwidth, and as much as they can, the better. And what sort of great nation operates on the hope that people won't use the most important broadband technology of the day? Great nations put in all the capacity that they can with a lot of headroom, so we're actually taking advantage of that revolutionary technology.
I would, again, I can't speak for the E&C authority all the time. I can say professionally that I think that it is, I agree with Jim, it's extraordinarily important that we keep the highest amount of what I call evergreen technology, and that as the need and demand is there, you move that puck somewhere further. That you're always building your bandwidth to be more than you need now. And so that you're never losing the kind of application and innovation that takes place when you have that extra bandwidth to play around with. And I think that's a very important thing for us to talk about, is building as much bandwidth as we can. I think that you've got the cable companies and the wireline companies and the wireless companies all trying to build out as fast as they can. I agree with Diana, we can't do this just with private sector companies. You have to have everyone, both public and private, working together. And in North Carolina, we've incented some of our private sector companies that are big ones to move ahead to get into some of the areas that are tough. But we made them match us, more than match us with the money that we were putting in. So matching public-private money can also help. And again, there's always a place, though, for the little group out in Pamlico County to have 250 people on broadband wireless. There's always that need, because you're not ever going to get with a big carrier sometimes to the last mile, to the last 4 or 5 homes. So you have to figure out other ways to do that.
I think I would just mention that too, that I think our question was also in the context of the net neutrality debate, you know, how it connects here, because Comcast, of course, you know, in trying to control what they said was congestion on their network, they got in trouble when Arts Group, Public Knowledge, New America, Free Press, and others challenged that they were blocking peer-to-peer applications, you know, throttling those. And so Time Warner now is, for example, is one of the cable companies trying to take a different approach, experimenting with giving several tiers on the demand side. So saying if you want, you know, 10 megabits or 20 megabits a month, or gigabits a month, that you have to pay a higher rate. So in other words, if you want more bandwidth, you have to pay more. So Stan's son is going to be costing Stan a little more money perhaps. The good news about that, I guess, is that to the extent that these infrastructure companies see that there is demand for more and more bandwidth, then hopefully then they're going to be building out faster and faster to meet it, that it should provide the evidence to Wall Street, for example, that Verizon can extend Fios more quickly, or that AT&T might move to a true fiber offering rather than what it's doing. And so that's where you get the argument actually that network neutrality actually can create the incentives for faster build out rather than creating a market for scarcity.
Can I just say one more thing here? In 1994-95, I worked with Japan and the Parliament in Japan in a book called Digital Communities. At that time, I would have given you, you know, I should say a tinker's dam. People probably don't know what that is, but I would never thought that Japan would be where it is today. The difference is their government got behind this and said to their companies, to the NTTs, and to everyone, we are going to get, you know, bandwidth to the citizen. And now, this is 1995 or 2007, look where they are. I'm just telling you, this country has to move ahead, and it needs the government of the United States to begin to move forward and to get the private sector and public sector companies and provide some funding, provide some bonding capabilities, provide a clearinghouse, as was said, so people can see what's being done around this country and can share with each other and move this broadband forward.
Yes, right here.
All right, Andrew Lee, the Avis on Impact 8. How have you been able to offer incentives to right? Broadband covers the most key of rural areas in North Carolina with the lack of federal presence and exploration of broadband.
We have used the private sector money we had, and now the public sector money we have to go to those counties that have the least access to broadband. We are now at a point where we have 17 counties that are between 50 and 75% of the homes have access to purchase broadband if they wish to. Again, we're not talking about purchasing necessarily 20 megabits or 80 megabits. We're talking about at least DSL or higher. Our cable mode and higher, that's what we're talking about. So our money is, we do everything by bids. So the private sector, our bids, or a nonprofit could bid. We can give money to nonprofits and to private sector and to local governments. But we also require a match out there, in order to be able to spend that money and move it out further. So we're at 17 now that are between 50 and 75%. And we're at the legislature, at least in our Senate, has money right now for us to get more money to put out to get to those next 17 counties. So we can bring everybody up. But our issue is this: what about the 85% who are at 85? So we're going to go out and hold a meeting for everybody who's 85 and above to try to get to 100, and then the counties that are between 75 and 85, and say, how are you going to work with us to do this? How are you going to move ahead with us? What's the Chamber of Commerce going to do? What's the farmer going to do? What is the local, Jack and Jill Club going to do to help us? What are we going to do? So you really have to involve the entire community. And it is basically one thing, as I think Jim has said, it is how do we get to the upper edge of the world in competitiveness? We have to get to every citizen to get there.
Yeah, and in the report, you might want to take a look at one. We're very impressed by the Mountain Area Information Network that ENC, helped to get going. That's used as wireless in these, mountainous rural areas. Yes, sir.
I'm Victor Bass, consultant in national security policy. I would like to put this discussion in a broader perspective and ask a question in the connection. In 5 years, China's GDP will be higher than that of the United States. So we have to live with the second-rate economic position in the 21st century. Say, if we do the utmost in broadband, say, become #1 leader in broadband, have there been any estimates? What does this mean to the national productivity and to our GDP growth?
Can you take a step at that?
We have, in the report itself, cited several reports that have made estimates of that kind. It is, it could be as much as $500 billion to our economy for usage of broadband. And these are old studies. The value, I would think, if you did some of these old studies again in today's dollars, particularly with all of the new applications that also create value, with the savings possible to deal with new high energy prices and so on and so forth, I would guess that those numbers would be significantly higher than even the highest estimates. And to me, it just seems that the cost of investment in high-capacity networks for our country will certainly be high, but the cost of not doing it when we are in a world in which China is moving so quickly, when the other Asian nations are moving quickly into higher and higher bandwidth applications, when the Europeans, the European Union, we sometimes tell ourselves we have more broadband lines than any individual country in Europe, but that's 500 million people behind common barriers for their market, operating together, and many scholars believe they should be considered to be one unit. We're already behind them in broadband lines. Their incumbents in many countries are moving rapidly toward fiber connectivity at very high bandwidth rates. We have got to wake up and get moving, or else we will be a second or third tier country in the years out.
Can I just add a point to that. I think we all agree that the infrastructure is absolutely essential. It's necessary but not sufficient, though. We can't stop there. Once you have the infrastructure, then you have to begin worrying about things like information literacy and how people use the internet, and do they really use it to advantage? Do you have education? Do you have the applications behind it? Do you have many of the other kinds of policies that allow you to begin to do these things? So we need absolutely to begin there, but that won't get us all the way to where we're going. There are a number of other things that deal with education and policies that have to follow.
And I agree with that 100%, but you'll also see in our paper case histories of comparisons. You're absolutely right, having advanced communications capabilities is necessary but not essential, but not sufficient to attract the new economy businesses. But if you don't have them, you can be certain that you will not even be considered. And we have examples in our paper, two for example. One in the state of Washington, where a community called the Dallas had an advanced municipal communications network, and it was successful in attracting a new facility put up by Yahoo. By contrast, Danville, Virginia didn't have an advanced communications network. It's now building one, but it didn't have one when AOL came looking for a new facility, and it lost that opportunity to Prince William County, Virginia. That happens over and over again. So we are certainly not going to impress anybody in the world that we've got DSL.
I think it's also important to realize that it's not just attracting the companies that are there, it's the citizens and folks who want to live there and be entrepreneurs and create and innovate in those communities. A lot of people want to live in rural areas. Just heard Diana say she'd like to be out in Watauga County. A lot of people would like to be there and be innovators and be entrepreneurs. And we have found in North Carolina that it's growing the wealth in your community. That's very important. I would say one other thing to you. We have insourced back into North Carolina with Quintiles, which is the largest data tracking, drug tracking company in the world. And they brought back one of their data centers to Williamston, North Carolina, in eastern North Carolina. And the delta was only 20% between operating over in India and operating in North Carolina. And they said, if that's all it is, we'll come. What did they find this year? They had one person leave of all the people they trained, and they had one who moved with her husband, and their turnover rate, I think, abroad was 30%. Think of the savings that they had this year and by coming to Williamston, North Carolina, and think of the jobs paying $40,000 and $45,000 a year in a county that had a $25,000 per capita income. So that's what it means for rural America. So.
I really think that in addition to a national broadband policy, we need a national broadband application policy. To talk about, I think the federal government and state government, and your report actually discusses this, although not necessarily in that term. I think we ought to be more proactive in terms of public policy and disseminating information about applications that are available, and also promoting applications for social purposes, for video conferencing, for telemedicine, et cetera. There's some of that goes on, but I don't think it's done in a very concentrated fashion. And like I said, my 12-year-old knows more about video conferencing technology than I do. Right? I would have to do a lot of information. I'm not sure how I would get that information except asking my 12-year-old. I didn't find out about it. And so I think we could do a lot more in that regard to make sure. Building the infrastructure is like building a highway. I mean, it's necessary, but it's not very sexy. Actually, it's like who wants to talk about asphalt? But it's the cars that drive on the asphalt that are sexy, and that's where we really get the end benefit. So I agree. It's doing what again. I'm a fiber guy, right? I love fiber, but the infrastructure itself is not the end result. We've got to go farther than that.
I think there's one last question from over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mark Hewitt, and Jim, thank you for the report in advance. It was enlightening and certainly speaks to the choir with the nature of the group here. But as you know, I'm involved with about 5 different, what I call build a city or greenfield projects around the world, only one of which is in this country. And I noticed a very common theme, and I would refer to it as political will. Clearly, we have in a state some interest and political will to bring about economic prosperity as a result of an infrastructure play in the country. But I heard two FCC commissioners both make contradictory statements here earlier today, one of which applauded an FCC auction as highly successful because of the billions of dollars of excess taxation it has imposed on the lack of infrastructure in deploying wireless in this country. And number two, another commissioner refers to a project in Sweden where, by the way, a broadband Corning fiber optic infrastructure, by the way, was able to deploy common infrastructure in Sweden, funding from the government that allowed last mile delivery to, guess what, multiple service providers. So now individuals have a choice of service provider A, service provider B, service provider C. I was in Las Vegas conference just like you were, and listened to the top CTOs of Verizon, AT&T, and Quest. Verizon and AT&T, same old, same old. How do I create a walled garden? I got to control it all. We're going to build it bigger and better, but it's my approach. Quest admittedly wants to go IP and bring it to the world at, by the way, gigabit levels. But I think they're only saying that because they couldn't get the I'm going to control it infrastructure up in place. So what we as a country have got to do is create a political will. We've got to take the documents and the documentary films and the data from Jim's report, and we have to bring it home to our communities, we have to bring it home to our state senators and congressmen, and we have to enable an FCC to actually bring about a technical community. By the way, the technology to do this, believe me, we've already done it. We already know how to bring about military, public service, education, healthcare, all of the things that make that work. Believe me, when I go to Dubai, I don't get a question of, are we going to bring, gigabyte level service to every hotel room and home in Dubai and in these new cities. When I go to Mexico, this isn't even a question. Brazil, it's not even a question. Spain, this isn't even an issue. Florida, where I'm going to build a city in Florida, I'm ruled by the Bear Stearns guys, which is, how much money am I going to make for this? Well, what do you mean? You're going to increase the economy, you're going to bring better, how much money do I make from it? And that's the kind of attitude that we've got in this country, that somehow we have to bring about what government was originally created for. If you remember the first...
Well, let's give the panel a chance, because we're already running over time, just to make in response to that, a closing thought for the whole...
May I take one moment to defend my customers in the private sector companies, because I think it's important to realize if we're asking those guys, excuse me, to put up their own money, right, then you got to allow them to make some money off of it. And they, as Jim said, they do have to go to Wall Street. They're dependent upon Wall Street, right? So they got to persuade those guys that they can do something with it, and what Wall Street cares about is making money, right? And so if we're going to do it in a different way, now clearly Mark is not going to go everywhere in the country, Jane said, and so if we're going to do something else in this country with a different model, that's yet to be determined. But at this point in time, we're still very much relying on the private sector.
Well, we've got a lot of different things that we need to do, and places are different, and needs are different, and solutions are different. One size fits all just isn't going to work for our country. So first of all, if we've got communities that are ready, willing, able, and eager to do things for themselves, and they can't get what they want at the rates that they want on the timetable they want from the private sector, we ought to be encouraging them to take that step and not throwing barriers in their way. And we're getting to the point where that is more commonly accepted. In other places, the private providers are the only realistic opportunity. If you don't have the local champions, it just won't happen as well in those communities. As Yogi says, if they don't want to come to the stadium, you can't stop them. And so there are many different things. A country as great as ours is going to need a lot of different solutions. What's most important here is that we're having this dialogue. And I think it's fair to say that most of us in this room think it's urgent. We need to get moving. We need to move forward. We can't afford to sit back and let more time pass. If we're going to be a great nation, we've got to move now.
We issued a report you've heard about earlier in January called Big Broadband, and it comes to the same conclusions. You're hearing, I think, everybody say, we've looked at this, we've seriously studied it, we're coming to the same conclusions. We know we need the technology, we know the kind of technology that we need. We know how to propose getting this done. We suggested a three-way partnership, a third, federal, state, and private providers. We know that kind of thing is possible. We know what the benefits are. And I think that it is simply imperative that we get on with it. We can study it to death. Maybe this is the will, but it is about real opportunity for real people. We are in the internet age. It's not going to go away, and we can either sit on the sidelines or we can get it done, and I think it's time to do it.
I would just add that I think that it is important that documents like EDUCAUSE, like the one we've done, and others be made available to the candidates who are running for President of the United States, that we push on their policy people to really tell us what they plan to do. That's very important, I think. The second thing is, I think that the Conference of State Legislatures, the League of Municipalities, these are groups that can really be helpful in bringing the political will to get things done. And I think in the long run, it is the citizens in this country who can really bring about that revolution. And it means that we have to get out among them and begin to let them see what's going on and why we need to do this. And that's why this report is important. It's why we're going back out to the citizens this fall. And we fully expect that if we get this 100 megabit North Carolina, that we'll be back 1 gigabit North Carolina. It never stops. This is going to continue to move forward in replacement technology. Okay, thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you to the panel, and thank you to you all for being a devoted audience. You're obviously very interested in this issue. There will be a video of this on our website shortly, hopefully by the end of the day, and some shorter highlights, along with the links to any of the documents here, the study and the presentations and so on. So thank you.
And thank you, Michael, from all of us.